next year, I'll add that to my wish list. Okay, welcome back. This is our final afternoon. We have two amazing sessions. The first session is restorative justice, and our guests are the Honorable Joanne Motaiki and the Honorable Maria Hernandez. Both have worked in juvenile justice, although now Judge Hernandez is our assistant presiding judge for the Superior Court here in Orange County. I have been asked not to read their bios, so I'm not going to, but I have them here and they're in your program. So we're going to start, and Judge Joanne Motaiki is going first. You have a clicker here if there's PowerPoint.
Oh. I'll be the first to admit I am not technologically advanced. Oh, thank you, Dr. Morgan, for letting me know that there's 100 people out there, all on top of what. I just have to remember from yesterday, Dr. Morgan Jr.'s talk about stress. Hi, everybody. I am so happy to be up here to be able to kind of like talk to you about our practices in juvenile court, specifically with respect to juvenile justice issues and the way we handle our cases now. But first, I think it's kind of important for us to kind of talk about juvenile court in general. I know most of you are probably already aware of how our court operates, but just in case you don't, I wanted to kind of talk about the two different case types that we actually have in our court system in juvenile. And that is one that focuses on the child welfare system and our youth and families who are involved in the child welfare system. I know that Christine Snapper was here yesterday. She talked about communities and safe homes. And I know that that directly plays into our child welfare system and how our communities are actually a big part of that support system to help those families reunify with their youth, their children, and support them in programs and services, or even providing alternative placements as safe homes for those youth. So also, Dr. Morgan, I know mentioned the annual children's report, Conditions of Children's Report, that's put out by the Orange County Children's Partnership that the court is actually a part of. And that, if you haven't had a chance to look at that report, it also speaks to the work that we do in juvenile court and the child welfare side, because it talks to the barriers or the continuing needs that this population that we service through child welfare system need in our community, and the continuing support that our community needs to provide those youth. But I've been only asked today to focus my time, because we have limited time, on juvenile justice issues. So Dr. Morgan, don't be thinking about next year's agenda when we're talking about child welfare. I don't want to ignore that, but I know you already got that in your head. So the focus today is juvenile justice and our practices there. More importantly, the restorative practices that we're engaged in. I first want to kind of talk about the setting. So these are facts and figures from 2019. It's unfortunate because, as we all know, when we're dealing with data and compilation of data points, it takes a little bit of time to kind of actually get a read on our current populations. So these are just kind of numbers from 2018 as far as national report outs as to the populations that we see in our juvenile justice courtrooms. I will tell you that recent trends, and I know that you've all been keeping up with particular legislation in our state with respect to juvenile justice reform, our numbers are actually trending down as far as juvenile arrests and juvenile petitions that are being filed by the district attorney's office. Yes, and it is a good thing. Yes, it is a very good thing. So I'm glad that people are clapping here in the audience, because the numbers are going down because we're realizing, again, this continuing theme of community support and actually trying to intervene with our youth before they enter into our juvenile justice systems and the formality of those systems. because I think a lot of people here and in the audience are already aware of the impact, the trauma that occurs when a youth is pulled from home and placed in a juvenile facility, especially a custodial facility. So it's good to see that those numbers are going down. The numbers coming down, though, do not mean that we then start reducing services or programs for this population, because as we all know, our statutory goals are still set for this population. And now what we're seeing is, even if our numbers are going down in population, our complexity is going up. We're recognizing more so how much significant complex trauma a lot of these youth have experienced prior to their dealings with law enforcement and prior to coming into our official court system. So the statutory goals have remained the same. And now that we have so many more rich recent studies with respect to the development of the adolescent brain, I know that there was mentioned that yesterday, we can recognize and engage more with a youth, knowing where they're coming from, trying to figure out where they're coming from, figuring out the environmental factors that bring them before our courts, figuring out how we can engage the family to support that youth to accomplish the statutory goals that the legislature has required us to fulfill through intervention through the court system. And that is rehabilitation, but also rehabilitation with the mind of looking towards the community to support that youth upon re-entry into their home and back into the community. So then recidivism, obviously rates are reduced. All right, so I think everybody is pretty much probably aware of the outcomes once a youth becomes involved in our court system. And these are just some kind of factors or outcomes for outcomes for youth that we often see. I mean, you've got lack of graduation from high school. You have a lot of our youth coming in and out of traditional high school settings, going back and forth from traditional high school to our local access programs because of credit recovery issues. We have a lot of youth who haven't been able to get that high school diploma. So I know that yesterday there was a lot of talk about educational components and how the Department of Education could support our youth in these efforts. And that's what we're trying to really do now, is really engage in partnership with the Department of Education, more so in trying to make sure that there's a smooth, warm handoff for our youth who are in and out of custody because of alleged probation violations or things that are going on at home. Unfortunately, these numbers kind of remain the same because I checked them actually Friday with respect to the 75% number of state prison inmates who do not complete high school, as well as the fact that 70% of our state prison inmates are former foster youth. All right, so this little chart, I don't know if anybody can see this. These are up-to-date percentages. They actually, every year I've been doing this, they don't really change much. But I do really want to highlight the bottom two, which is the 68%, which I alluded to earlier, with respect to incarcerated individuals who are in prison who do not have a high school diploma. And then again, 70% of those in prison actually came out of foster care. So those are pretty stark numbers. And that's why I was talking about what the efforts are on the child welfare side, as well as our juvenile justice side, because I think what we are intended to do today is kind of talk about the progression, because Judge Hernandez is going to talk about the adult side of things. And we often see our youth coming from the foster care system, and then they're either dually involved in our foster care system and juvenile justice system, or the foster care system leads them right into the juvenile justice system. And if we don't do anything on the juvenile justice side, then unfortunately they may end up on the adult side. But Judge Hernandez is actually making efforts to address issues on the adult side for that very young population of TAY youth that she'll talk about. All right, so our practices in juvenile court with that background rely on collaboration. And I know that this effort is really a community effort, because we look at collaboration through all of our agencies, social services, healthcare, probation, the Department of Education, DA's office, PD's office, county council, sheriff's department. We have the court-appointed special advocates who are actually specifically assigned to our youth to be that mentor. Orangewood Foundation is a huge partner. Children and Families Commission, Regional Center. Our community-based organizations have become more increasingly involved in the support of our youth. A specific example are our specialty collaborative courts. Our courts in juvenile court are unlike any court, meaning regular criminal, adult court, civil court, any other court, because we are really looking to the voices, not only of our youth, but also of all of those community partners, of all of those agencies, county departments, to come in and basically kind of loosely have a multidisciplinary team meeting about this youth so we could figure out what are the issues and how do we support this youth going forward. So we have at juvenile court 6 specialty collaborative courts running. Our juvenile court system is set up to be collaborative, but in Orange County, we have taken the additional task of establishing specialty collaborative courts like teen court, which is a high risk, high needs, dually involved, meaning involved in both systems, child welfare and juvenile justice systems, to provide more dedicated, intensive support for youth who have been identified as high risk, high needs. We also have our truancy response program, which is looking at chronic absenteeism that was mentioned yesterday. We have our youth development court, which is looking at young adults who originated out of juvenile court who have serious or violent offenses and have been maintained in juvenile court and not sent to adult criminal court. We need to provide reentry services for those youth, rehabilitative services for those youth. So community partners come around to wrap that youth up so that we have those reentry services in place. We also have our recovery court, which is a substance use dedicated program for our youth who have substance use issues. And then Grace Court. So Grace Court is the generating resources to abolish child exploitation court that Judge Hernandez started. And I think it was 2014, 2015, I think was when the discussion started happening, and then you took off in 2015. And she's shaking her head, so I'm assuming that's correct. And then I had the pleasure of taking over that court when Judge Hernandez went to do other exciting things in the adult world. So Grace Court is a perfect example of this collaboration and these practices that we utilize in juvenile court. Grace Court operates on this multidisciplinary team model. It services the victims of human trafficking. We have about 35 to 50 youth participating in that program at any one time. We have a set of dedicated social workers who are trauma informed, constantly keeping up with all of the education and training to support these participants. We have Cadence, who is never forgotten, our support therapy dog, who is there in court with us. We have representatives from the social services department. We have representatives from the healthcare department. We have Department of Education liaisons. We have folks from the probation department who are also equally trained in these trauma-informed practices for this particular population. We have DAs who are at the table who are actually prosecuting potentially the trafficker, and the young participant in court is the victim. That DA is in an unusual situation with Grace Court because not only is that DA prosecuting the adult trafficker, that DA is potentially prosecuting in juvenile court terms the young woman or young male who is the alleged victim. So they're playing they have 2 different hats and they're playing 2 different, slightly different roles, but it works. The public defender's office represents a lot of these young people in our court. We have dedicated appointed counsel who represent the youth. And then sometimes if the youth is dually involved, meaning there's a child welfare case open, we have representatives who are appointed to represent the parents of the of the participant. Thank you for that. So the youth Grace Court meets every week. And I really do leave it up to our participants. Their voice is the most important part of that team. And what we always start off with in Grace Court is, you want to come to court, come to court. You don't want to come to court, it's okay. You don't want to talk, it's okay. We don't have to do anything, but just kind of sit here. Sometimes we'll just talk about what we're doing over the weekend. It really is youth driven. And I really do try to make a point of making it youth driven because I want their voices to be heard. As we all know, in dealing with human trafficking victims, that voice is taken from them, and we need to give it back. So it's really important for that court, for me, and all of the team members, that person's team. And I always say that we're your team, and it's your terms. So it really does give us an opportunity to just kind of sit across the table, because I come down off the bench. Judge Hernandez came down off the bench. It's just a practice in our juvenile court, specialty courts, to just kind of sit down at the table with all the participants, and just have a conversation, talk about whatever we need to talk about, whatever they want to talk about. And I think that's the key of this program that makes it a little bit different and special, for the participants. The buy-in from all of our stakeholders is also significant. I mean, you have public defenders who are ingrained in being, they're like advocates. They need to be the advocate, but they actually, I've got a time card. I love it. And I usually don't take a whole lot of time, so I was shocked. Our advocate, they're actually understanding of the position, because they know and they're advocating for what they believe is in the youth's best interest, which sometimes, as we all know, some lawyers would tell you, is not really what an advocate is supposed to do, oftentimes in a normal criminal or adult setting. So we have their buy-in. Oftentimes we'll get youth who are contacted by law enforcement, and there's an understanding that if this youth is out of county, and in need of services and a victim, then the law enforcement will bring them in on an allegation that may be, giving false information to a police officer, which normally an attorney would say, well, why are you going to hold my, why are we bringing this case before it? We all kind of have this understanding. It's so that we can then wrap that individual with the services that he or she would like. So it's this buy-in from the stakeholders that I think Judge Hernandez set up very well for us, that I think makes the Grace Court program a success. Okay, so this is just a quote that we share with all new bench officers, as well as anybody who is interested in the court system. The bottom line is that this quote speaks to how we need to move forward with our juvenile justice cases and the way that we practice and handle those cases in involving the community, even more so now than ever. Our youth who are coming into our juvenile facilities now are serving, because of the complexity of their cases, they may be serving a little bit more time, so that then we need to look at really reentry, and reentry should start when they come in. The minute that they come into custody, if they are coming into custody, we need to start looking at what is the reentry plan for that young person? What are we going to do the warm handoff for mental health treatment? What are we going to do as far as making sure that their home is a safe place for them to return? So it really is a community effort, and it takes a huge village right now. And the members of that village need to constantly remember, Dr. Morgan, Judge Hernandez, that the children are not okay. Thank you.
I did forget my glasses, so I don't want to turn around there. Can I see back there? Okay. Look at it's right in front. That's awesome. Okay, so thank you for having us. And I love that Dr. Morgan's already thinking about what next year's Ensure Justice theme is. Because since about 2009, I think I get a call from Dr. Morgan within at least 48 hours of Ensure Justice to come over and sit down and talk about, what do you think of this is the theme for next year? Have you already started planning? She has. Which is a really good thing. And that is the blessing. And I'm going to start off where Judge Motaiki left off, that village, that collaboration, and how important it is for our children because they are not fine. And they're not fine. And I love looking at Nicole out here who did a fabulous job on her presentation. We were sitting there at the table, a couple months ago. And as Dr. Morgan was telling the story of the warrior and asking that, how are the children? All we could think of is they're not fine. They're not fine at all. And it's our obligation, it's our responsibility to help them be fine and find a path so they can be fine. One of the things that I talk about with young adult court really takes me back to just the criminal justice system. And having spent almost a decade at juvenile court, I was so lucky when I moved out of juvenile court, I had Judge Motaiki, who was able to take my place as our presiding judge over juvenile. And she's one of the most humble, innovative women I know, with a heart for children. And you could hear that when she talked to you about what the intent and what the purpose is and what that collaborative approach is and why it works for our children. I don't know if Kathy's in this room, but I'm really going to practice our children. I have a really bad habit of, and Dr. Morgan picked this up, my kids. When I was at juvie, I keep referring to them as my kids. I need to step away from that and remember they're our kids. As much as we want to make sure we're helping them, the voice of our children is really, really important at the table. In the criminal justice system, is it a good system? Is it a fine? Is our criminal justice system okay, Judge Motaiki? No. Is it better than most anywhere else? Yes. Is there a lot of room for improvement in how we respond to crimes, how we respond to accountability, how we hold individuals in the system accountable? Yes. So when we talked with Dr. Morgan about the collaboration that's in this room here and all of the workshops and what we do with our Department of Education, who is a partner in this particular conference as well, is what are our next steps of collaboration? How can we respond differently? Restorative justice, what does that mean? What is justice, or what is restorative justice in the criminal justice setting? And what I should have put up in one of these slides was, the good old Venn diagrams from your old time in school, and where is that overlaying? What I'd like to talk about when we talk about restorative justice is you have your offender, my defendants in the adult side, because now we're going to switch from Judge Motaiki's area from the juvenile justice side into the adult side. The community is another one of those circles, and the victim. And they all overlap, because what does everybody want to know? We want to know our community is safe. The community, the neighbors who are to your left and to your right, is everybody okay? What is happening in our community? What's happening in our world today? I mean, it's heart-wrenching to know what's happening in the Ukraine. That touches us here, but it really does reckon back to, what do we have as far as that overlay in that Venn diagram? How do we keep our community safe? How do we make sure our community is involved in all of those slides that Judge Motaiki talked to you about? You have to have everybody at the table. How important that becomes with the victim, and having a fulfilling experience for a victim who's been victimized. Let's not forget, when we're talking in the criminal justice system, there's also a victim and the reparation to the victim involved. And how do we address that while keeping public safety, that balance that we're expected to do, and your community? So it's always striking a balance. And trust me, somebody won't like what you're doing, but you have to be able to say, step out of your comfort zone and do something. What's our song, Dr. Morgan? Dear younger me, right? Do something. So when we talk about these specialty courts that Judge Motoike shared with you and how many of them we have in Orange County, especially in our juvenile court, we are leaders in the state, if not the country, because we see that there's innovation and there's different ways of how we respond in our justice system, better ways. They're not always the ways that it's been done previously, but you got to start doing something. And don't worry about labeling them, by the way, because when Judge Motoike was talking about the years, yeah, I think it was 2014 or 15 that we called it Grace Court, but we've been doing it since I met Dr. Morgan in 2009. And as I was bringing in partners to the table saying, we need to respond to these issues, and it's here in Orange County, and nobody wants to really admit that trafficking is happening with your children right here in every one of your cities in this county. And both Judge Motoike and I constantly speak to groups to remind people of that. It's a pervasive issue here in this county. Don't put your head in the sand, it's there. So again, I look at the things that we have to balance, especially as judicial officers, when we're talking about the criminal justice system and even the juvenile justice system. Let's talk about equal access to justice, fiscal responsibilities, and disproportionately represented folks. Children and young adults and adults of color are overly represented in the criminal justice system. That's something we have to continue working on. And please, anybody who lives in Orange County that thinks, except that doesn't happen here in Orange County, yes, it does. And I'll give you some facts that bear that out. I think Judge Motoike would tell you our juvenile hall population is still probably upwards at 70% of Hispanics in our juvenile hall correctional facility. That is not our general population here in Orange County. So again, there's still work to be done. The things that I really want to work on too is how do we continue to make things better? Well, we have to make sure we're making good decisions and good policy. And how many of you are academics in this room that talk about data? How many data geeks do I have in here? I know I have a handful, admit it. Okay, this is important because, you know, a long time, and especially in the justice system, judges especially go, well, I've been doing this for 25 years. I just got this feeling in my gut. That's what I should do. I'm sorry. No, you need to have validated data and collect accurate data so we know, are we making the right decisions? Are we making good policy? Is there a better way to do it? And also be okay with, tried that and it didn't work out so well. Okay, because that's what pilot projects are about. That's what pilot programs will help you with. And you can find out, didn't have the bang for the buck that I really needed. I didn't serve as many that I needed to have served and the cost that it has. Remember, we're all responsible fiscally to somebody, whether that's your employer, whether that's the state, whether that's your home. We can't just throw that out because, of course, if we had just unlimited amounts of money, we could do things a lot differently, but that's not the reality that we live in. So those are important key factors that I always have to look at. So when I left juvie court, I actually started planning this next collaborative court before I left juvenile, and Judge Motoike and I talked about that because, you know, our TAPE population, your 16 to 25 year olds kind of just fall in between where people want to say, hey, did the crime do the time? If they did the adult crime, then they need to go to adult prison and be treated as an adult. How many of you think that that works? Really glad that I don't see any hands going up because it doesn't. When we talk about developmental sciences and where the young adult brain is at, it's really important that you identify, learn that, and know that how we respond and how we hold folks accountable is really important. Not saying, did you notice I'm saying responsible and accountable? This is not, you know, the Monopoly get out of the jail free card that says, oh, just because you're a kid, you shouldn't be held accountable and responsible. It's how you do it. And one of the things that I learned as I started doing some more of the research was, look, our TAPE population is less than 10%, I think, of the general population in the United States right now, but yet it's making up almost 30% of your arrests and 30% of your jail population and your state prison population. That's important to note because it says that is that segment of the population that's coming in and out of our prison doors like the revolving door, and we're not making it any better. I also took a look to make sure Orange County was consistent with that. And sure enough, the young people on formal probation, 22% of our probationers fall into that TAPE population. And then this one, when we talk about recidivism and reduction of recidivism that Judge Motaiki shared with you a little bit, our TAY population is reoffending at a much higher base rate than anybody else. And at least 80% of them are rearrested within a few years of being arrested. So does that tell you incarceration is fixing it? Just build more prisons and that will fix it for this population? It's not working. And of course, just talking about the adolescent brain development and where they're at, that's difficult enough. How many of you have teenagers in your home now or have had teenagers, right? We will always, oh, mom's pointing directions over here too. We will always say this, look, you start talking about a young person about 15 or 16 years old. Do they know the difference between right and wrong? Absolutely they do. Okay. How many of you have asked your young person in your home or that teenager, you knew it was right or wrong? Why'd you do it? What's the answer you get? I don't know. That's exactly it. Because we're talking about where the brain science is at. Where's the development of the brain? So we're not saying cognitively they don't understand. We're saying that social maturity gap is not there because the frontal part of their lobe, that brain is not developed yet. They're getting all of their primitive experiences and their wants and their needs from the backside of the brain. And it really is problematic because they're good kids, but they're making really poor choices and poor decisions. So this was a court, my young adult was created from the sciences and bringing in all those collaborative partners that we talked about. The academic world, I have to have the science at the table with me or this means nothing. Because if I can't validate that this court is working on how we're intervening with young people charged and convicted of felonies, then shame on me. I need to be able to take my data at some point and say, we're doing things differently and it's working because my recidivism rates are lower. My academic rates are up, meaning I've got kids graduating, getting their high school diplomas, their GEDs, they're employed and they're housed stably. There are hundreds, if not thousands of data points that we are capturing, but I'm just mentioning a few when you talk about why validating data is so important. But what this young adult court program does, it's a case management style. It's something very different than the usual criminal justice approach to a young person charged with a felony offense. How many of you think a felony offense might have some lasting consequences, shall we call them? Checking the boxes, right? What do we need to do to bring in those collaborative partners to make that change? Because we know that young people can change under the correct circumstances and they just need some guidance. Again, holding them accountable when we talk about that restorative justice model, accountability, responsibility, making sure your victim is made whole, making sure your community stays safe. But what is the drawback then of that young person who completes this program and has that felony either reduced or dismissed? Isn't it truly a win-win? I'm going to tell you that's certainly the hypothesis of this program is that once we get a felony forward. So who is eligible for this program that I run? Well, they are young people, 18 to 25 that are here, residents in Orange County. I have to have them living here for the services that we can provide. Sadly, as you can imagine, I have to pick a group. I don't have enough resources, fiscally or otherwise, to say I can let everybody in. So I have 30 slots in my treatment group, which means I have to figure out a way to make it fair for the at least 2,000 or more at any given time that are eligible for this program. How do you do that with eliminating selection bias and everything else? Who are my scientists? Randomized control studies. Did you ever think you'd see a court involved in a randomized control study? That wasn't an easy thing, but yes, that's exactly what we're doing. And males offend at a base rate much higher than women do or females do. So this is why we took the males for now. The hope is if it's proved out to be correct, we open it up for everybody. The eligible offenses, just briefly, because I could spend 3 hours going over this program and still not cover it all, is they are felony offenses. They don't have prior felonies because we want them to leave the program without a felony offense. Because oddly enough, you can't even get a dog walker's license if you have a felony conviction on your record, just so you know. But there's about 47,000 other collateral offenses when you're talking about these convictions with somebody who has to check a box and say, I have a felony conviction. So really important that we can reduce to a misdemeanor or outright dismiss at the end of their period while they're with us in the group. Here is just kind of phasing through the steps of our program. Those felonies do at this point exclude murders, rapes, use of a weapon, anything that has great bodily injury in it. But about everything else comes walking through my doors. We see if they are legally criteria eligible. They go through an analysis to see if they are evaluated and they are volunteering into this program, because it's an important program that we've got to have their buy-in. Then we go through the randomization process, and I can talk a long time about how difficult that was to get over that hurdle. Lawyers do not like randomization. We go through assessments with them. They ultimately plead into us. We give them a window to be able to come back out of that program if they get into it and go, this wasn't meant for me, and I don't have that in me to go through these hurdles. That we have expectations. We have case managers, we have clinicians, we have probation officers, nonprofits who are working with us. So there's a lot expected of this young person, but in the end, ultimately, after 18 months to 2 years, they can come to the court, come back to me and ask for that felony to be dismissed, reduced to a misdemeanor. But I can tell you most of them have been dismissed up to this date, and it's been running about 3.5 years. This is a slide that I told you about when we started off about the overrepresentation of young people of color and the mass incarceration of young people of color. It bears out in this program as well. And this is talking using a randomized control study. So we're bringing in a randomized selection into our treatment group, as well as the control group that is also followed by my researchers, which not mine, by the researchers. We have a really great, a phenomenal team, but our researchers pull all the data. They interview these young people at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and then we'll follow them for longevity purposes so that we know, hey, do we have a reduction in recidivism? How do they look after they've completed our program, as well as while they're in the program? But as you can see, you know, what we have as far as our African-American Black population in Orange County, it's actually less than 2%. But yet 17% of my young people are Black in this program. Same with our Latino population. So we really need to do some more work on that. I'm not saying what we're doing here is perfect either, but we really need to address that, identify it, and know there needs to be changes with what the justice system is doing and how it is working within those populations. Just to give you kind of a snapshot of what they look like in my group. How many of you know what the average IQ is, by the way? Roughly 100, Dr. Morgan, doctors, Morgan squared here. There are multiple tests and there's a lot of research out there about IQs, but let me just share with you, the majority of my young people have very low IQs, at least a full standard deviation below the normal. They're sitting at around 85 to 87 is where we're at. So it's important that we're working with them, even talking about the developmental sciences, but also working with where they're at because of where they're at with their IQ, being culturally competent, understanding if they're dealing with substance abuse issues or mental health issues. It's a whole collaborative, holistic approach to the young person who's in front of us. Average 11th grade, with 28% of them that do not have their GED or their high school diploma. I talked about this. Here's where it's important, because a lot of folks will ask me, well, how's it working so far, Judge? Preliminary data is pretty good. And this data is a little bit dated because of COVID as well. So we'll get some new uploaded data. But you'll see from the lines here that when we talk about the treatment and baseline offenders, what they came in with, do you see even at the 3-month marker, how many of this, and this is self-reporting, but it is borne out by checking rap sheets later on and through probation, that you see a significant decline in actual offending, criminal offending. And that happens actually even within those first 3 to 6 months. Our control group, however, just continues to offend without the intervention because we're tracking them. That's how important it is to have that control group to make the comparisons. So we are already seeing a pretty significant reduction in recidivism from those who are participating in the program. This school enrollment, in light of this program that we're talking here, how important is this? When we talk at baseline with the groups, they're pretty similar, 28% and 31% where they're at as far as school enrollment. But look how those numbers start to change. And by the 6-month marker, I've got my kids, 40% of them are enrolled. We're only 8% in the control group are actually enrolled. So back to just who is a participant in this program and supports us. Obviously, the education piece, the research piece, UCI are our researchers at this point. The courts, the CAP OC help fund us. Orangewood is a partner that is always at the table with us. And recently, Samueli has come to the table for us and offered a tremendous amount of support via fiscally so that we could have clinicians working with these young people. I will tell you, it's just a start moving the dial in the right direction. It takes, as Judge Motoike said, a village. It's got to be commitment. It's got to be your willingness to say, we talk about having those sensitive and difficult conversations. You don't have change unless you have them. So the fact that you all are here and continue to participate, it's trailblazers like Dr. Morgan who take us to the next step by doing these educational pieces every year to say, we're moving in the right direction, but we're not there yet because our children are not fine.
It's table time. This is your chance to ask questions. And I know people have questions. Look, Maria, you've got water here. Yeah, there you go.
I don't have nice water like this.
We don't either. I don't know how we got that. Okay. You guys have so many microphones to choose from. You can start submitting your questions here. One of my questions is about how we're going to bridge the gap for the TASE court. I should have written it out while I was listening to you. For the kids that are in, I want to know what to do for the kids who are in the 8% red bar.
So, this is the very difficult part about a randomized control study is there is a control group. And it was a very difficult thing to address, even with the lawyers who say, how do I go and tell my client, I'm sorry, you were eligible, but they always just say, judge said you lost the flip of the coin, which really it is when you put in the algorithm and pull out who goes into control and who ends up in that 8%. Do no harm. Obviously, we're not doctors, but we're not harming those young people. They are in the justice system, the normal course. That 8% is definitely out there. So I guess what I would do also is challenge you. Meet those young people, that 8% where they're at, which is they really need a lot of assistance. That means community intervention. That means being aware of you have neighbors next to you that are potentially part of my 8% that we're talking about, and being able to be open-minded to saying, oh gosh, but is that person involved in the criminal justice system? They must not be a very good person or a bad person. There are no bad children. There are children that have made poor decisions, exercised poor judgment, and that some scenarios that are scary. And I'm not minimizing that, Sandy, but I am saying that we have to be willing to be open to embracing the 8% while I'm working with my other percent that's doing much better because I have a treatment team around them.
So basically what you're saying is you're going to stay in your lane and do everything you can do.
Yep.
And we need to be in our lane doing everything we can do. So, Judge Motaiki, what gaps, needs are there in our Orange County Grace Court? Look, and out there in the internet.
We do really well, but we have a lot. So how much time do we have today? Because we have a lot of gaps and needs, and people at regular meetings for the county, I know they hear me beat this drum all the time. And I know that Judge Hernandez knows what I'm talking about. Placement, safe placement. It is, and substance use. Do you know that we have very limited substance use as far as residential facilities for our young people? We're sending them out of county for that, away from their families. It's a constant conversation. Those are the two biggest barriers that we have right now, because, you know, as we all know, human trafficking victims and substance use, they go hand in hand. I mean, we saw the reports out yesterday, I believe, through the panel, that it's something that we need to address with our Grace Court participants in order to get them to the place where we can actually wrap them around with our therapy and break that cycle. But it is across the board for all of our youth in our systems, our welfare systems and our juvenile justice systems. We don't have enough placement options for these young people to go.
Okay, you have your marching orders. What can we do to limit the racial disparities within the juvenile justice system? So Dr. Motaiki, Judge Motaiki, you're first, but you've got JJ as well, so you can make your comments.
You know, that one's tough because it's a constant battle that we have. It starts from the bench's perspective. I think the bench tries its best to put the blinders on, but we deal with the population that comes before us. So unfortunately, it starts in our streets. It starts with the community interventions. And that needs to change. We need to do more training, I think. But it's going to be a slow change because we're all aware of the numbers. I mean, one of the slides that I also put up there, I didn't go through it all, but all those numbers suggest and show that there is the disparity going on. So we are, as judicial officers, we're mindful and we are always trained, take gender, take race, take everything out of that equation and look at your case. So that's a way that the bench can address it. But as far as, you know, we see the people who come before us and they come before us because of that community intervention, the law enforcement that touches upon them. Judge Hernandez.
Yeah, I would say what touch point, because you really have to take it back all the way to where was the first contact. But even more importantly than that, go into the communities and look underneath it all. Where is it root from? Where, when we talk about our families, especially in the juvenile system, you know, you really need to walk it all the way back to, you know, our children aren't fine because the families aren't fine. So let's start there. And our child welfare system and our social services put to our door. It doesn't say that we're not, that we don't contribute to it as well. But to Judge Motoiki's point, we all do what we can. Nobody says here, oh gosh, I want to be part of a system that is disproportionately overrepresented with our children and our young people of color. But what I will share with you is that you have to be aware of it. It's that education piece and having, again, the really uncomfortable, sometimes difficult, challenging conversations about it, because it's not going to change until we do something different. And I think that's where we have to be at, is being willing to go out of our comfort zones and do something different and acknowledge that we have an issue.
So this next question is from Kendra. Kendra, where are you? Oh, okay.
Really cool hat, by the way.
And always, and check out her shoes. So this question, she put her name on her question, and you just said something that kind of triggered in me. We have to go out of our comfort zone. Today is Kendra's birthday, and she came to teach workshops. Oh, different Kendra? Oh, see, I can't see you because of this, but it is Kendra, the other Kendra's birthday. Oh, because it's her birthday. All right, good. Well, so this Kendra then asks the question specifically to you, Judge Hernandez. Some people assume that because there are more system-involved young men of color, that they're offending at higher rates. Can you speak to some of the reasons we see more in our system?
Well, Kendra, that's the problem, is what the data that's being captured is of our young people or our people of color in the system. So again, that's why I say you really have to take it a step beyond before they're captured and identified into the system, what brought them to the system and what was broken that got them there. Because that's all our hope is. We want to be able to address issues regardless of race, gender, color, to make sure that we're addressing those social issues. But it's really hard. I mean, there's no quick fix. There's just not a quick fix, but we also have got to understand we can't have disparate treatment either. And that is the beauty of, and I can't believe I'm becoming like just the data nerd. This is why you have to do randomized control studies, because otherwise you start talking about selection bias and, oh, we only want this person in because I think that person will do better, whether it's intentional or not. And usually it's not intentional. Usually it's, let's all talk about the implicit bias that every single one of us in this room has. And even with best efforts, some of that implicit bias leaks into how we do our work.
And someone asked, do you work with big brothers? Big brothers? Either.
Well, we have mentors and we work with Project Kinship. Necessarily my probation officer does more of the outreach, and whether it's with big brothers specifically, I don't know the answer to that. So I don't want to either commit or deny. But we work with a lot of our nonprofits for mentorship.
And another question, why is solicitation of sex from a child largely still only charged as a misdemeanor in California? I think that's wrong.
You're doing the adult side.
Oh, so it's the perpetrator is only charged as a misdemeanor, the one who's purchasing. You've written on this. Go for it.
This is something that, again, Judge Motoike and I have to be very careful how we address issues to make sure we keep our neutrality as we sit on the bench. But what I will say, and I know that Sarah's here and movement legislatively for laws that we have to file or that are prosecution cases that are filed in front of us, we don't have a choice. They come to us. It's a prosecutor's job to determine what they are going to file and how they file it. There obviously are numerous sections for trafficking per se that deal with minors that are straight felonies. They are not misdemeanors. But a lot of the times, and I know that we've had conferences where we've dealt with the demand side of it. And so when you see solicitation charges against particular sex purchasers, sometimes those victims are children. And I don't know as if some of the law enforcement agencies and some of your prosecuting agencies recognize that, especially when we see the sweeps. So again, those are legislative changes that have to be made. So speak to your legislature. Those are also prosecution determinations that are made outside of what Judge Motoike and I address.
So this question is twofold. Why do prosecutors insist that the child has to appear in court to testify? Why can't a teen give evidence once and that be admissible in court?
Okay, so this one's a really difficult one, especially when you are an advocate on behalf of the children. That's why I'm going to take this, because this one was a lot easier when I was in the juvenile court and not on the side of the adult where there is a trafficker that's being prosecuted in front of you. So the Constitution, obviously, we all believe in the Constitution and due process. Due process requires a confrontation of the witness who is bearing evidence against you. And as much as we want to embrace and protect our children, and that means whether they are victims of child abuse, human trafficking, any of our sex charges, there is a right to have full cross-examination, because I know that this is distasteful to people in this room, but there are witnesses, including children, that are not truthful, that there are occasions where individuals are wrongly prosecuted. And that individual has the same right to make sure that they have the ability to fully cross-examine and confront the witness against them. So not having the ability to have that particular child subject to cross-examination. Now, remember, as courts, we control our courtroom, and we are going to protect a child witness, and we have special evidence codes for children, especially children under the age of 10. There are some limitations and there are special things that we can do. But I know that's something that's difficult for folks to say, well, they should only have to tell their story once and should never have to come to court. You would hear loudly from many, and I'll let Judge Motoike take this from a different perspective as well, but to say, well, how many wrongfully convicted individuals do you have sitting on death row that have been sitting there because they were wrongfully convicted and not subject to appropriate due process? And I will also tell you the Project Innocence really addresses, when we talk about disproportionality and racial disproportionality in our prison systems because of wrongfully convicted and prosecuted individuals. That's a whole nother can of worms we open.
Yeah, and I just have to agree from the perspective, I only see the juvenile side of things. We don't ever get involved in the adult side, which is nice because as a juvenile court presiding over Grace Court, I deal with the alleged victim. But we do get questions. We get questions about why do I have to go? What kind of support will I have if I go to court? And we kind of have to explain or have that conversation, just as Judge Hernandez explained, about everybody's constitutional rights. And there's a right to due process. There's a right to confront, and it has to be applicable to all, or it means nothing.
We're very grateful that both of you are willing to serve in such challenging situations. Next question. I think we have time for 2 more. What interventions exist in the court system to support restorative practice for traffickers? They often come from abusive conditions and family systems as well.
I mean, that's one of the benefits and beauties of Grace Court, is it definitely does allow the victim to be heard. And it allows them to be heard in a context in which we have everybody at the table. And then it allows the support when they transition into the adult world to testify. The whole team, if the whole team's available, the whole team will go. They'll support that victim wherever he or she may need to testify. Sometimes we have federal court appearances. The team will go, the team will support. So we make sure as a team that that victim's voice is heard.
And last question, because we ran out of time, not because we ran out of questions. What kind of parenting interventions do we still need to help youth not end up in our juvenile system?
That goes back to the whole community support. And I think the efforts, I know we touched on the Orange County Children's Partnership. I think there's a huge effort that partnership is undertaking right now to look at and identify barriers and needs, gaps in services across the continuum from birth until 21 years of age. That group is really taking a deep dive. And it's a group that is representative of the community. We have a lot of community partners in that group, as well as the agencies and stakeholders to the court. Probation, DA, everybody's involved in that. And they are working very hard through subgroups right now to identify across the board education, health. I know that Christine Snapper is working diligently on one of the groups with respect to safe homes and communities. I mean, that's an actual group that she is helping head up to address gaps, needs, and services. And a big component of that is parenting and the support that we give to parents, because one of the pillars under that work is to identify and try to prevent the entry of our families and our children into that child welfare system. So it is really a good movement, and it's really good to see that everybody in the county is willing to step up and do that work.
Thank you so much. Can you give them a big hand? As the next panel, you don't get a break this time. This is our last panel. We're coming back to our Department of Education with leaders in Orange County education. Ruthie's going to facilitate, and then we will wrap up our afternoon.